Welcome, everyone. I'm James Latwell, your host on Authors on the Air, part of the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. And we have a special treat for you today. We have the celebrated author of the Detective Superintendent Roy Grace series with us, Peter James. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be here.
It's great to see you. Now, I mean, this series has been longstanding. I think it's 19 or 20 in the series itself. And I mean, Roy Grace has captured the imagination of a lot of readers out there. And I think recently you kind of had some news from an unusual reader that maybe, kind of got people's attention. This was like in the last week or so. Would you care to talk about that?
Yeah, it's my number one fan. um, Her Majesty Queen Camilla is a big supporter of books. She started an Instagram book club when she was still Duchess of Cornwall during lockdown. And she recently this year launched a series of podcasts in which she takes an author and features them for a week. And I was one of the guests in this season, and last Monday the podcast was broadcast, and the interviewer asked her who her favorite fictional detective was, and to my utter amazement, Queen Camilla said that Peter James is Detective Superintendent Roy Grace. And she said why. She said she liked the fact that although some of the stories are terrifying, you have the comfort of knowing about Roy Grace's home life. And she said she loved all the twists and turns that kept her on her toes. So that was a pretty nice accolade. I think
It's not
I
bad
was
at
in
all.
tears. I was in tears when I heard it. To be honest,
I can imagine. I mean, the way I heard it, you could tell this wasn't a press release that she read. I mean, she was actually invested in the series. She knew how to talk about it. And I mean, yeah, I think you have a fan there.
I do. I tell you quite a funny story. When she launched her Instagram book club, if we wind the clock back like about 8 years, I get an email one day from a friend of mine. He said, "Whatever you're doing, stop it. Go out and buy a copy of the Daily Mail newspaper now." So I go out and I buy a copy of the Daily Mail, and there is a photograph of Camilla, then Duchess of Cornwall, in her office. And there were 9 hardback Roy Grace books on the bookshelf behind her head. And in the interview, she said I was one of her 2 favorite authors. And I wrote her a letter. I wrote saying thank you so much, and she wrote me a handwritten letter back. And I then would send her every new Roy Grace book and my standalones, and she would write me always a written letter back. And then when she started her Instagram book club, which it's only on Instagram, and it's now called the Royal Reading Room. It was then called the Duchess's Reading Room. She invited me on it, and what she did on the Instagram, she takes an author and features them for 2 weeks, and she interviews them. They do some readings, and we were filming Grace down on the harbour just outside Brighton, and she said, "Oh, I'd love to come down and interview you there." So it's all very prescribed when royalty does a visit. So we were sent the briefing sheets. Her security had come down a few days before, checked it. A helicopter lands at the airport at 11:05. Her car arrives at the harbour side 11:15. She will interview you upstairs in a warehouse until 11:50 a.m. and then she'll spend 10 minutes meeting the cast and crew. She'll watch filming for 10 minutes. Then she'll go upstairs and be private and have her lunch. And anyhow, so I greet her and we go upstairs into it's a warehouse with 2 wooden chairs and a crate. And she has some of her entourage. And she was interviewing me about Roy Grace books. And she knows more about them than I do. And she's got a great sense of humor. She loved hearing kind of quite gruesome stories and about some of the villains I'd met. Anyhow, then we finish the interview and I take it down. I introduce it to the cast and crew. We watch some filming and it gets to 10 after 12. I said, "Okay, Your Royal Highness, I'll now leave you to have your lunch." No, come and join me. So I go back upstairs in the warehouse with her kind of lady companion and her private secretary, sit down back on these wooden chairs. And the private secretary produces a thermos flask and a banana, which she gives Camilla. And she digs a sandwich out of the bag, which she gives to me. And I'm sitting there having a sandwich while she's having her soup and a banana, chatting to her like we're old mates. It was surreal but wonderful.
Wow, that's amazing. That's an experience. Yeah, that's one of those once in a lifetime kinds of things. But you have a book that's come out in a couple of just a couple of weeks now. It's They Thought I Was Dead, and that's Sandy's story. And Sandy is Detective Roy Grace's wife. Um, and I got an arc and a teaser on the cover. I think is fantastic. Some will know how it begins. Some will think they know how it ends, but nobody knows this. And it's Sandy's story. Could you tell folks a little bit about Sandy's story without giving maybe too much away?
With pleasure. Yeah, when we first meet Roy Grace, in the first novel in the series, Dead Simple, we learn that he's a very effective homicide detective, senior investigating officer in Sussex Police, but he has a personal puzzle of his own that he can't solve. And we learn he's just coming up to his 39th birthday, and we learn that 9 years earlier, on his 30th birthday, his wife Sandy, who he loved and adored, worshipped, vanished. He literally came home the evening of his 30th birthday, looking forward to going out to dinner with her and their two best friends, and she was gone. No clue, no note. And for 9 years, he's been looking for her. He doesn't know whether she got murdered, whether she ran off with a lover, whether she had an accident, whether she got kidnapped by some crazy and is kept down a cellar or took her own life. And he continues to function as an effective homicide detective. But all these 9 years, he's been looking for her. He's even gone to mediums, to spiritualists to see if he can make contact. And he hasn't been able to move on in his own life. And then as the series progresses, Roy does start to move on. And then I start to show readers little glimpses that maybe Sandy wasn't quite the perfect wife that he's always idolized. And that, maybe she was actually kind of quite a flawed person, that maybe she is still alive, maybe some of the time in Germany. And I had originally intended to set this mystery up. What I wanted to do, when I was asked by my publishers back in 2003 if I would like to try and create a new fictional detective. And I'd, for years, have been going out with the police on research for my earlier psychological thrillers. And I got to know a lot of police really well. And in particular, one detective who became my role model for Roy Grace. And the one thing that I saw as a almost cliche in crime fiction is you have the detective with a broken marriage and a drink problem. And the reality is in the British police today, no cop with a drink problem would last 24 hours. It just wouldn't happen. They'd be out. And I thought I wanted to make Roy different. And I thought, well, what is it that police officers, what detectives do? And really, they solve puzzles. Every homicide, every major crime is a huge puzzle, thousands of pieces that have to be painstakingly put together. So I thought, I'll give Roy Grace a personal puzzle of his own with the idea of the missing wife. And I'll set the mystery up in book one, and I will give the resolution of what happened in book two, which is called Looking Good Dead. Anyhow, Dead Simple came out, and firstly, to my amazement, it was an instant hit in many countries around the world. But secondly, we started getting inundated, and I mean inundated, with emails and some letters as well, speculating what had happened to Sandy. And I thought, hey, you know what? We could have some fun with this. So I kept it going, and I kept it going for like the first 14 books in the series. And the letters started getting more and more, not angry, but I started getting some quite indignant. And I remember about 6 years ago getting a letter saying, "Dear Mr. James, I've just worked out that I'm a lot younger than you, and I imagine I'm a lot fitter than you are, which means you're going to die before me. So I hope you've left the secret of what happens to Roy's missing wife safely in your publisher's vaults."
That's amazing.
And I
So
had a,
what yeah,
sorry.
that's great. I mean, there was so much fan interest in her story. So I'm glad to see this piece come out, as it did, and by the way, I think, what, 3 days after release, it was a number 1 bestseller on
In
the
the
list
UK,
there.
yeah, it went
Yeah,
straight to 1 on 3 days, which is amazing.
that's amazing. What was it about why this time? How did you decide to release Sandy's story now?
Well, I felt that I maybe tortured my readers enough about the mystery of it. But also, I what happened was I thought, you know what I'll do is I'll write a novella, just a
Mm,
100-page novella, and that will reveal the truth about why she really left and what she was really like as a personality. And I'll call it "They Thought I Was Dead: Sandy's Story." And I began writing it, and books have a way, I'm sure you know this yourself, books have a way of taking hold of you when you're writing. And suddenly I realized there was so much to Sandy that I didn't know. It may sound bizarre, as I'd invented her, but
yep.
she intrigued me.
Huh,
And the more I wrote, the more I thought, I want to make this into a full-length novel. I think this has got real potential. It's not going to be a crime thriller per se, but it's about a criminal. Um, and
yeah,
and she, and she does get up to some pretty criminal activities in the course of the novel. So it's not a detective novel, but it's a novel about a villain in trouble.
very true. Very true. Now, in the course of writing, the Sandy story, did you learn anything new about Roy Grace?
I did, yes. Because obviously we've always seen Sandy from Roy Grace's perspective, um, and as a perfect wife who made their house beautiful, couldn't do kind of anything wrong. Now we see Roy from Sandy, and part of the reason that she left him is that being married to a cop is not easy.
Right.
If you're, a lot of police marriages work because you've got two cops married together, or a police officer married to some other emergency service worker working crazy shift hours. If you're married to a homicide detective, and what we see from her point of view is that you could a good police officer never gets away from the job. And there's a scene in Sandy's story quite early on when she and Royce are going out on their wedding anniversary, and they're in a taxi, they're going to their favorite restaurant, and suddenly Roy Grace spots a villain walking down the street in the center of Brighton who he's been looking for 2 years. So he tells the cab driver, he says, "Stop." And he says to Sandy, he says, "Look, order me a gin and tonic. I'll meet you in the restaurant in half an hour." And he hairs off down the street. She's still sitting in that restaurant at 10 o'clock at night while Roy is still booking this villain into custody. He chased him for 2 miles, tackled him, handcuffed him, and now he's at the custody center. And she's just sitting there getting more and more angry. Uh, and and then there's another bit in the book where she realizes that he is usually being called out at any time of the day or night to investigate a murder. And a murder usually destroys not just the victim's life, but it destroys the life of all the loved ones of that victim. And
Right.
she's sitting there thinking, you know, am I being selfish, getting angry because Roy goes off? Is it more important that I go out to our favorite Italian for a bite of meal, or that he actually tries to help the family of a murder victim? So she's kind of torn that way, but and then also I think one of the things I try to show is that police officers are not highly paid. Certainly in the UK, they get a reasonable wage, but nobody joins the police to get rich. And Roy's happy with that. He's not a financially ambitious person. He absolutely adores his job. His dad was a cop before him. It's his vocation in life. Sandy becomes dissatisfied with that, and annoyed that he can't see that. She becomes friends with a very rich girl who's got a beautiful house with all the toys, and she starts hankering for that life. So she tries to then, without giving any spoilers away, supplement her income by doing a little bit of gambling, and that
Right.
starts spiraling.
Right. And yeah, the gambling does factor in there. And I was curious, any personal research on the gambling front that you had to do for the book?
Oh yeah, well, I had to go to Vegas, and I well, Roy Grace, I always played poker. I had a boys' game for a minute, but it's kind of very low stakes. It's like
Mm,
maximum of, if you lose $100, you have to stop. And so, but gambling's always fascinated me, and I spent quite a bit of time when I was researching the book in a casino in Brighton, just talking to the staff behind the scenes. And there's a tip that a croupier gave me that actually Sandy uses about if you go to a casino where they're playing roulette, uh, find an empty roulette table with a bored-looking croupier, because most casinos, they have to keep the ball spinning. So to do something, they have a target, and usually they make the target the zero, or if it's a double zero, one of the two zeros.
yeah.
So play the numbers around zero. She kind of uses that tip. But also on a serious side, I did a lot of research into gambling addiction,
Mm,
because it's such a destructive force. At the end of the day, not many people are ever going to beat the odds in a casino or in a horse race, and it ultimately it destroys people.
yeah, very, very true. And I think you captured it very, very well in the book, that aspect of it.
Thank you.
Mhm. Now, the first 8 books in the series with Roy Grace have been turned into a hit television show on ITV. I mean, and you've won the CWA Diamond Dagger, and not to mention Her Majesty's accolades. What is it about Roy Grace and the series that attracts viewers and readers across the globe? It's not just a UK phenomenon. I mean, we have Roy Grace followers out here too. What is it that draws people to him and the stories?
I think people just to there's a further 4 that have been filmed, and they're going to be out in BritBox, I think, from July the 2nd in America.
Okay.
Ahead of England. It's not coming out in England until September. I think one of the things I always joke when people say, "Can you describe Roy?" And I say, "Well, if I was ever unlucky enough to have a member of my family murdered, Roy Grace is the detective I want running the inquiry." He's, I think, first and foremost, he's a kind human being, and what I know a large number of homicide detectives, and the ones that are good are the ones that have a really high level of empathy, high emotional intelligence. The good ones, you quite often on television, you'll see the bullshit detective, get out of my way. This.
Right.
That's not how they solve murders. Not how good ones solve murders by actually being kind and gentle to all the victims and trying to connect with them, get as much out of them. So, and Roy is exactly that kind of person. He's a connector. So I think people trust him. They warm to him. He's not entirely without his own flaws. And I always remember there's a great line from Chandler from years ago, and he said, yeah, a detective is a guy who walks down mean streets who is not himself mean.
That's very well put.
Yeah, and I kind of feel that about Roy. He is the man dealing with nasty people, horrible
Hmm.
crimes, but hasn't lost his humanity.
Yeah.
And equally, I think his sidekick Glenn Branson is a really warm guy too. And Glenn is based on a cop that I met back in 1993. I was spending a day out with Brighton Police, and I was just put in a car, and there was an elderly guy. He was like what they call an old sweat in England, like he'd been in the force for probably too long and was close to retirement, counting down the shifts he's got left. But there was this young, big, bald black guy, full of energy, called Glenn Douglas. And we were chatting, and I said to Glenn, I said, how old are you? And he said, I'm 32. And I said, are you going for promotions, anytime soon? He struck me as being a really bright guy. He said, well, it was only my second week in the force. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, I was a nightclub dancer.
Wow.
And he said, my kid was born. And I looked down at the cot and I thought, one day you're going to go to school and somebody's going to ask you what you do for a living. I want you to be able to say something you're proud of. And I applied to join the police the next day. And I think some of that comes across with Glenn, that sort of warmth, the fact that he actually cares.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, with a long-standing series like you have with Roy, are you ever afraid that the creative well is going to start to get dry on new story ideas? I mean, where do you keep them coming from?
It may sound strange, but you're a writer yourself, so you probably understand. I say a lot of stories find me. I mean, I try to take subjects that it's going to take a year to write the book. So it's got to be something I want to spend that year of my life doing.
Exactly.
So, the last Roy Grace was about the huge trade in dogs that exploded during lockdown, and villains realized they can make more money out of smuggling, stealing, and illegally breeding dogs than out of drugs, and with much smaller sentences. But my next Roy Grace, which is called One of Us is Dead, you asked me where the ideas come from. Oddly enough, I just bumped into the son of an old friend of mine. And the son I've always liked him. He's quite a sly character. And he said, I've got a story you're going to want to write. And I said, I get told this probably once a fortnight. And I'm sure you do. Yeah, and fine. It may be a good story, but it's not necessarily one I'm going to spend a year of my life turning into a novel. He said, Peter, you're going to want to write this. So he was so convincing. So I said, okay, we'll meet you for a coffee. So met a couple of days later, and he said, right. He said, guy I know, and he's a bit dodgy, was at a funeral 2 years ago. And he arrives late. It's a country church, and the church is rammed. It's pelting with rain outside, and he has to stand at the back of the church because there's no seats available. And halfway through the service, he sees a guy sitting 6 rows in front of him, whose funeral he went to 2 years before and gave the eulogy at.
I like that. That's great. This has been a lot of fun. We're going to close out with something we call 3 quick hits. And I'm going to ask Peter 3 questions, and we're going to put him in Sandy's perspective here. He's going to tell us what Sandy would say. What is Sandy's favorite drink or her favorite cocktail?
She actually loves white wine, but she's not averse to having a vodka martini.
Very good. That fits. And how about what's Sandy's favorite music?
I would say she likes Van Morrison, probably as kind of top of her list.
Okay. And finally, what's Sandy's greatest fear?
Sandy's greatest fear is being found. She's escaped. She's kept herself hidden. She's changed her name. She's terrified of being found because there's somebody after her who, if he finds her, it's not going to end well.
That's very true. Folks, we've been talking with Peter James, the author of They Thought I Was Dead. It's the latest in the canon of Roy Grace novels, and I really encourage you to take a look at this. It's a fantastic standalone piece, and if it's your entry into the Roy Grace world, then it's well served. But Peter, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Oh, Jim, it's a pleasure. Lovely to talk to you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you, and we'll see you again soon, I hope.
I'd look forward to it very much.
Take care.
You too.